After years of enjoying impressive growth figures, Brazil's economic growth has slowed considerably, leading economists to question whether this soft patch is here to stay and the outlook for the Brazilian economy going forward. I have two special guests on the line today, both Cristiano Souza, Senior Economist at Banco Santander, Brazil, and Neil Shearing, Chief Emerging Market Economist at Capital Economics in London. Thank you both for joining me. Now, firstly, Cristiano, what are the main reasons behind this turnaround in growth we're seeing? Is it a soft patch and is it here to stay?
Actually, there's been a lot of discussion about it. Economists haven't really reached a consensus on what's been hitting growth. Recently, some economists, they think it's household consumption, which has decelerated really in these past quarters, but it is still growing. Some economists believe it's investment. Investment has had three falls in the past quarters, up to a 1.8 quarter-over-quarter fall in the first quarter of this year, so a very strong fall. Some economists think it's a matter of productivity as well. I tend to think that we are seeing a slowdown in productivity coupled with a low level of investment.
Well, Neil, looking at this lackluster growth, where do your forecasts stand for GDP growth this year and going forward?
We're right at the very bottom of consensus expectations for the Brazilian economy over the next couple of years. We think growth will be only 1.5% this year and 3.5% in 2013.
Okay, well, why is that?
It's a confluence of factors, really. On the demand side of the economy, the rapid credit growth we've seen in recent years has to slow. Households are now looking at increasingly stretched, and balance sheets there are looking at somewhat vulnerable. The housing market looks like a bubble, and prices perhaps need to fall by 30 to 50%, and that will obviously have an impact on consumer confidence. And at the same time, some of the external factors that have supported domestic demand in Brazil over the past 5 years or so, notably record high commodity prices, we think those might fall back, which would put a big dent in some of Brazil's sources of income.
Cristiano, interestingly, with GDP growth slowing, what is public confidence like in Brazil for President Dilma Rousseff and the popularity of her centre-left government?
It's a funny thing in Brazil because even though the GDP is not accelerating, we're probably having the second year of disappointment with economic growth in Brazil. The labor market is very tight. We're talking about historical lows for unemployment rates in Brazil at 5.5%. Unemployment rates are at a level never seen in the country. And wages are increasing in real terms. They are growing much more than inflation, about 5 percentage points above inflation. We're not seeing in Brazil a rise in unemployment with that slow growth. Quite the contrary. So that is what really supports the government's approval ratings.
Well, Cristiano, looking at the strength of the Brazilian real, what about future possible currency interventions by the Brazilian central bank to control the appreciation of the real?
Brazil, being a very big commodity producer and a very big commodity exporter, would be very much prone to shocks to commodity prices, in a sense that when commodity prices go up, the exchange rate should appreciate in the country. The real should get stronger. Now, it seems like the government is trying to keep the exchange rate from fluctuating too much. Why not below 2? Because they're concerned about competitivity. But on the other hand, they cannot let the exchange rate slip to higher levels strongly, because it could also lead to inflationary pressures in the economy. So what we have in the end is probably a currency that's fluctuating that very narrow band of 10 cents between 2 and 2.1 reais per dollar.
Neil, in your opinion then, what are some of the other factors which have been hindering the Brazilian economy? For you, is it Brazil's huge dependence on commodities or the strength of its currency?
Indeed. Brazil's dependence on commodities, I think, is sometimes somewhat misunderstood. Commodity exports from Brazil only account for around 6 or 7% of GDP, but the commodity sector itself is perhaps equivalent to about 20% of GDP. Obviously, as the price of commodities have increased, then Brazil's terms of trade have improved dramatically too over the past decade. That's given it more income, which it's spent. It's also attracted more investment into Brazil too, particularly into the commodity sector. But there's a flip side to that, which, as you mentioned, is the strong currency, and that's crimped the competitiveness of manufacturers and producers in Brazil. Now, in technical terms, this is what economists tend to refer to as Dutch disease, where a dominant commodity sector crowds out a manufacturing sector. And so the common assumption, I think, that Brazil will do well because it's a big commodities player is misplaced. I think actually, if you look at long-run growth prospects, they're better for economies that tend to be manufacturing-based rather than commodities-based.
Cristiano, if we take this all on board then, what are the main issues that need to be addressed in order for Brazil to move forward in building a diverse economy and boosting growth?
We have to look at probably government services as a whole. I mean, for example, the tax system in Brazil. It should be simplified, not of bringing the tax burden down, but probably simplifying the tax structure, because that creates a lot of problems and a lot of costs to the economy.
What about you, Neil? What's your opinion on this?
Well, I think in the near term, measures need to be put in place to deal with what I think will be a weakening of demand over the next 12 to 18 months. I think fiscal policy will probably become a bit more active. Monetary policy is going to have to stay relatively loose as households start to clean up their balance sheets. And I think the government's going to need to probably intervene in some banks that will probably experience some problems with the quality of their balance sheets as the credit cycle starts to turn. But looking further out, Brazil's long-run prospects really depend on supply-side reforms, and that really means efforts to raise the investment rate.
Just to end with you, Neil, there's quite a lot of comparison of recent between Brazil and Mexico, as some economists picture how Mexico might surpass Brazil in terms of economic performance. Do you believe this could be the case?
I think it's going to be very difficult for Mexico to actually overtake Brazil in the years ahead in terms of the size of actual GDP, because after all, Brazil is a much larger country in terms of its population. That is not to say, however, that I don't think Mexico will start to outperform Brazil in relative terms in respect to their growth rates. I think it will. I think Mexico is a much better balanced economy. It hasn't seen such excessive credit growth as Brazil. It has a much stronger manufacturing sector. Its producers are far more competitive. So I think Mexico has a lot going in its favour. It looks like the government there may well be a bit more reform-minded over this next presidential term, which would be good. I think Mexico will probably outperform Brazil over the next 5 years or so, but I don't think we're going to be in a position where the Mexican economy itself is actually larger than Brazil in terms of GDP.
Cristiano Souza and Neil Shearing, thank you again for joining me and sharing your outlook on the Brazilian economy. I'm afraid that's actually all we've got time for at the moment, but please make sure you stay tuned to Dukascopy TV. For the moment though, goodbye.